Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 42 of the Ask Historians podcast. This is part 2 of our conversation with Celebreth about the Roman military during the Republic era. We'll be picking up after the end of the Second Punic War and kind of the decline and stagnation of the Roman military at that time, moving into the Third Punic War and also the Marian reforms as well. We'll continue talking about how class and social status affected the Roman military and looking at the history of Rome through a military lens, essentially, as we continue through the Marian reforms into talking about the rise of the triumvirate and especially the rise of Julius Caesar, before rounding everything off with Augustus, or Octavian at that point, and the end of the Republic, the beginning of the Empire, and his principate. So, hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
So now that we've got these permanent garrisons kind of popping up and these more career soldiers as opposed to the season-to-season farmers who take up swords and then go back, what is the situation back in Rome? I mean, you had said that the families had kind of been in charge of these farms before, but now, obviously, you have more of a population that is away from home. So what's going on there?
Well, one big problem was that, first of all, these soldiers, they were sort of paid for their service, but it was essentially pay that was going straight towards living expenses. It wasn't anything you could really consider a paycheck you could live on. But they still had the sort of mentality of, oh, these guys are still farmer soldiers, citizen soldiers. They're not necessarily professional yet. They just, have to stay in a garrison for 10, 15 years instead of heading back home every time. And the issue there was, come harvest time, the menfolk weren't there to help out with the farm. So the problem with that is the size of the fields, etc., meant they couldn't be harvested. The fields would eventually go fallow, and when these guys got back from their deployment of however long it was, they would come back and they would have basically a plot of relatively useless land. And I'm sure you can imagine useless land is, especially when you've been a soldier for 10 or 15 years, you're not in the mentality of farming. You
Right.
Look at this and it's just, you see hell to work with, basically.
Right.
And back in the home front, the wealthy saw the situation and, well, they capitalized on it. They would buy up land from people for low prices because it's crappy land. So they would, so the soldiers, basically seeing themselves as no other option, they'd take the money and they would head to Rome to see if they could find work. The problem is Rome, the city of Rome, in the late 2nd century, 1st century, was it was nearing 1 million people in population. And most of those people were jobless, basically homeless people. They didn't have enough money to sustain themselves or anything else, and they were basically just surviving by the skin of their teeth, kind of thing. If they were surviving at all, some of them starved.
So it's kind of a classical version of like the veterans problem thing, where you have people returning and then they just have nothing to do. There's no work for them or anything like that, right?
Absolutely, and there really wasn't any work for them. So the number of people who had the land started getting smaller at this point, and some historians, a prominent one among them being Adrian Goldsworthy, do hypothesize that during this period of time, the requirements started being relaxed a little bit. Like they would start equipping people instead of people having to equip themselves the whole time. There would be little stipends, little, stuff to help the poor landowners actually be in the military so Rome could continue fielding this military.
Mm-hmm.
But this was a very long process over a vast period of time, 50 to 100 years.
Right.
And one of the great hallmarks that we can really look at for the situation with the Roman army is in the 140s BCE, 149 to 146 specifically, when Rome decided that Carthage was recovering too quickly and no longer really deserved to exist. If you look at a gentleman named Cato the Elder, he actually ended all his speeches with, if you look at the Latin, it's Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. Polybius, Polybius, I believe, actually translates it more closely to Carthage must not exist, which is slightly more ominous. I'm not sure which one I like more. But either way, Rome decided eventually that they were going to war with Carthage again. And because, of course, Rome had the best army in the world, they were indomitable, yada yada. They got an army, everyone was gung-ho to go, rah, rah, rah. But the problem is, these guys, they were compared to the legions of Scipio Africanus. They were a mob. They had no discipline. They had barely any respect for the commanders. Mm-hmm. And they were very, very, very poorly trained. You can see an extreme difference because the consuls thought, oh, it's just Carthage. Carthage is just one city. We'll walk over it. And it just didn't work that way because the consuls were eager to try to, they were eager to try to get all the glory for being the ones who defeated Carthage. And they weren't ever able to really train their men or muster their men. And it's showing a really, really marked decline in the quality of the army as these older veterans from the Second Punic War died off. And these people from the Third Punic War, they're sort of living on the laurels of their fathers and grandfathers, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. They live on the memory of being great. And this is a rather large problem in Rome because there are a smaller number of men who are able to be in the army, and it's declining constantly. And the armies themselves are becoming poorer and poorer and poorer in quality because the consuls just don't even train them anymore. They don't bother to. Because with the garrison forces, most of what they're doing is sitting around. They had to deal with, some small rebellions here and there, but there wasn't there weren't any large-scale wars. And so many of the soldiers weren't exactly trained in hard, long-scale warfare.
So even though they're providing more of the arms and kind of armor for these men as time's going on, they're not really doing any sort of enhanced training or any kind of real training like you see in the Second Punic War, right?
No. That's basically the entire problem. And we actually see two generals who really turned this around. One was, I love Roman names, they get really long. Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilius Africanus Numantinus. I believe I got that right. He's the adopted son of Scipio Africanus. And he, said he had himself elected consul because of the laurels of his father. And he's, saying, oh, my great father, the guy who conquered Hannibal, I'm going to be the one who conquered Carthage. So the Romans, they placed a lot of stock in family name, and he was elected by a landslide to go solve the situation in Carthage, where the Romans were actually doing really badly, just because they kept trying to climb the walls and batter them down. It just wasn't working. So he got there, and we see him, the sources seem to be slightly biased in his favor, but we do see him try to completely reorganize the army as much as he can. Even so, I've read a couple of theories that postulate one of the reasons Carthage was ravaged as harshly as it wasn't actually salted, but it was really, the troops just went completely out of control once they got in the walls. One of those reasons is Scipio wasn't able to actually hold on to them with discipline any longer. He's just basically said, well, we're in, go nuts.
It was just kind of a scramble for loot and pillaging.
Yeah, which the thing is, there's actually a really good example in Polybius when Scipio Africanus was Spain and he conquered New Carthage, of how Africanus actually was able to split up the cities into zones and basically made organized pillaging happen, where every cohort would get one small section of the city, and they would loot it, and they would bring all the loot to the center of the city. No one kept anything for themselves. They would dump it in one big pile, and it would get all sorted out for everyone, which is honestly astonishing because organized pillaging sounds absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, certainly that sounds like maybe some of the romanticism of like pirates in the golden era of pirates, exactly, where you have this loot all gathered together and then divvied out evenly, and nobody's gonna hide any jewels underneath anything or anything like that.
Of course not. But that's what our records say Scipio Africanus was able to do. And then you look at Scipio Aemilius Africanus, and he's barely able to control his men enough to get them to actually conquer the city. And when he does, well, he sits on a hill and watches the city burn.
Mm-hmm.
That's all he can do. So you see a real decline in the quality of the Roman army between the First and Second Punic War. It's really interesting, honestly, because you think of the Roman army almost as they thought of themselves. You think of them as invincible, these incredibly disciplined men who are, the most disciplined of their era. They set an example for everybody else. They march always in perfect lines and are always stoic, the whole 9 yards, whatever Hollywood decides to tell you these days. But especially in this period, they weren't that. They were essentially just an armed mob.
Right. Kind of armed thugs just roaming around.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, they still had their battle lines and such.
Right.
But they lacked the specialty of
mm-hmm.
their forefathers, really.
Mm-hmm.
We'll speed forward a little bit from 146 BCE, which was the fall of Corinth and the fall of Carthage. And we'll move on to 107. And that's an extremely significant date because, as I mentioned, the qualifications for being in the army were probably declining at this point. I mean,
right. So if the initial qualifications were you were from a farming class or something and you could provide your own arms, and that kind of sorts you into your class, and as they're providing more arms, what are the qualifications at this point?
We're not quite sure. It's honestly all hypothetical. The only thing we have to go by is in 107, when Gaius Marius decided that he was going to recruit his men directly from the urban poor, the men who had nothing. And he would provide their weapons, their armor, their training, because he was paying for them and he wanted a quality investment. He would pay them, he would give them land after they were discharged, and they would essentially they would be his own personal army for the next however long he needed them. Mm-hmm. When they were discharged, they had a nice little retirement plan. He promised them bonuses and loot, the whole 9 yards. And these guys in Rome, remember those old soldiers who kept having to sell their land? They loved this idea. He apparently had people flocking to him, from what we know. And his army filled up instantly. And the reason he actually had to recruit from the head count themselves was because the Senate refused to actually allow him to recruit another army because there weren't enough men to recruit.
So it seems like a really good deal for those soldiers that had to sell their land if they're getting put in this army and then they're promised, oh hey, after you're done, then you get some land and you get some stuff afterwards too.
Exactly. It was basically the American dream for the Roman, if you want to kind of think of it that way. It was like if you decided to join the army and they'd give you a free education, free housing, and a guaranteed job kind of thing. And it was all focused on Marius because he was the one making these promises. It wasn't the Roman state making these promises. It was Marius, the individual, making these promises. And that might sound like a little bit of nitpick, but it's actually hugely important when it comes to the next 100 years of history. Because these men, they were loyal to Gaius Marius. The Roman state had done jack diddly for them. It had basically tossed them out on the street and left them to burn. Marius had given them food, pay, promises of a good life, an opportunity to do something.
Right. So you obviously, as you're saying, if they're loyal to Marius and not to the Roman Senate and the Roman leaders themselves, then you'd imagine that Marius might use this as kind of a political tool to advance things that he kind of wanted done, right? Is there any kind of that going on?
Absolutely. And the Roman army was always tied up in politics, but this really signified an upscaling of even that, where the Roman army didn't just, define politics by saying, oh, I was a first-year centurion in this legion under this consul, which would be a pretty good thing.
Mm-hmm.
No. This is a general basically saying, you and what army aren't going to get between me and what I want.
Right.
So,
right.
So you have a little bit of that muscle coming into play now. And as I mentioned before, these generals, since they were paying for these armies completely out of their own pockets, they were making sure these armies were damn good. And these armies, from what we know, they are a scale above and beyond anything that had been recruited by the Romans before.
So how does the gear kind of different, or how is it different from the previous kind of supply your own gear as opposed to these generals supplying out of your own pocket? What kind of things do we see?
Well, one big thing we actually see is standardized gear, which it doesn't sound like as big of a deal as it was, but you've got to remember, if you're supplying your own gear, you buy what you can afford. With the general buying it, everyone was able to get a shirt of mail, a shield, a sword, a helmet, greaves, a full suit of paraphernalia. They would pay for the clothes on your back, the tent you slept in, the food you ate. Everything was paid for you, instead of you having to buy all of this stuff yourself with this tiny little stipend that the Roman state had given. And the standardization really it gave us this whole uniform view of the Romans that we see now. I mean, before this time, you could see, some people wearing a big old bronze plate on their chest if they couldn't afford mail, or just going without a helmet, or without greaves, or without armed guards. The poorer you were, the worse your equipment would be. And in this case, everyone was equally poor.
Right, and on the opposite end, we had talked a little bit about the kind of formations that these guys were deploying into, and these kind of lines that they had, and we talked a little bit about the equites, but are they still employing this kind of auxiliary cavalry kind of thing, and is there any kind of changes in that as opposed to like who is being recruited into that, what kind of gear they have?
Oh, absolutely. The thing is, with these armies, it all depended on exactly where the Romans were and who the general was, because he would recruit auxiliary cavalry just depending on what he was fighting.
Mm-hmm.
So, when Marius went to Numidia to fight with Jugurtha, he recruited Numidian cavalry, or mercenaries in the area, and they would basically be his cavalry guard his flanks. And these mercenaries, the auxilia, were really, really incredible fighters. I mean, you'd think, oh, they're Numidian, they're not going to fight as hard against their own people. Yeah, no, they didn't care. They were fighting for a paycheck.
Right.
It's essentially the same as, the Romans. They're fighting for a paycheck. They're not exactly fighting for a nation. The concept of a nation was a bit blurry at this point anyway, so they were fighting for the person who's in charge.
Right. So the infantry is is Roman kind of makeup, and then your cavalry, you have kind of locally recruited mercenaries in most instances, right?
Essentially. These guys could be, they could sort of be gifted mercenary style people from local tribes who you had an alliance with. Or you could just be recruiting mercenary bands. Caesar in Gaul was famous for his German cavalry, which were excellent cavalry, and apparently they basically kicked the ass of everyone they came up against. I mean, we don't know exactly how true that is, but apparently they were really, really good. But again, it all depended on the locale. The infantry themselves, their formation was slightly shifted from a manipular formation. We're not sure if Marius was the one and only person who did this but it's essentially the benchmark. We know that this happened when Marius was there.
Right,
We
and
just don't know.
that kind of goes along with the standardization that he was doing with the arms and kind of army structure in this formation structure, right?
Yeah, we don't know exactly how long it took or if there was a process, a very slow process of evolution there. But we do know that Marius reformed the army, and he is our benchmark for that reformation. So we called every legion past Marius and before Augustus the Marian legions, or the post-Marian legions. And they were organized into cohorts rather than maniples. They would all fight generally still in the three-line formation, but there weren't any real distinctions between hostati and principes and triarii. You had just 3 lines of legionaries, essentially.
It was just one big mass. It wasn't like your fallback troops or specifically dedicated. It was kind of just infantry, right?
Yes. I mean, it was all up to your general. It was even more flexible than the Manipular Legion, to be honest, because it didn't have to really follow that set formation that the militia always did because they were used to it. You had these trained men who could be ordered to do something special, and you could expect those centurions who were appointed by the general now instead of elected by the people to really take the initiative. The centurions were expected to fight at the front line, and they were only recruited from the strongest and bravest guys. So sadly enough, I mean, that just means they had a ridiculously disproportional number of losses compared to the regular legionaries. But they got a nice paycheck. Yeah, they were reorganized into cohorts though, and these cohorts were I'm not sure the modern analogy. I would say an army, a company, probably. I'm not absolutely sure on the modern United States Army, so I can't really give a perfect analogy there.
But a fairly large group, right?
Yes. A cohort was 480 men, and it was divided into 6 centuries of 80 men apiece. Yeah, 80 men apiece. Each of those centuries was subdivided into 8-man tent groups, contu area, which literally means tent group. And essentially, if you were in a tent group, those 8 men with you, or 7 other men with you, were your brothers. They were the closest thing you'd have to family in the military. You would eat together, you would sleep together, everyone would sleep in the same tent, whole 9 yards.
It's kind of like your squad that goes together.
That was your squad, and you identified with that squad. Above that, you identified with your century. The century was commanded by a centurion, generally a rather junior centurion, and then those centuries would be combined into the cohort, which would also be commanded by another centurion. And the centurion ranks were based on whether they commanded a century, which were the lower-ranked centurions, and whether they commanded a cohort, which were the higher-ranked centurions. There were 10 cohorts per legion, so cohort 1 had the highest-ranked centurion of them all, the primus pilus. The second cohort had the secundus pilus, the second spear, and on and on and on and on. So that's essentially how it was reorganized. It was much more professional, is the best way I could describe it, because these men, they would follow their officers, but their officers were of a much higher quality than they ever had been during the Republic, and the training really paid off too. So these professional armies really started to take appearance, and the problem was the Romans, well, they weren't stupid. They knew exactly what they could do with private armies, and as you mentioned before, politics, military, they were hopelessly intertwined. And eventually, skipping a few very, very, very significant events in the process, well, actually, I really can't skip the social war here, because the social war was super important. It was an event where the Italian city-states, which were allied with Rome and had been throughout this, since before the Second Punic War, they were getting sick and tired of Rome basically giving them jack diddly. And they basically said, hey, we'd like rights. And Rome, being Rome, said, let's And so they rebelled. They started minting their own currency, mustered armies against Rome, and there were 3 years of a really bloody, really pointless war.
So these Italian armies that they're fighting against in the Social War, we're talking about the Roman army reforming into this cohort, this Marian army. But how are the Italian armies formed at this time? Are they all the way back in the Hoplite times, or are they in that maniple?
Hilariously enough, they mirrored the Roman legions exactly. It was Rome's first real civil war.
So
because they were fighting against
Marian
these
against
Italians.
Marian, okay.
Yeah, they were fighting against these Italians who'd been fighting with them for hundreds of years.
Right.
The Italians had basically copied the same things the Romans had been doing. They'd just not been considered the auxiliaries. And while they had provided cavalry, they'd also provided an equal number of infantry to the Romans. So they had the same setup as the Romans had by this point. And their entire politics system was hopelessly intertwined with the Roman system.
Mm-hmm.
So it was essentially mirror armies facing off against each other. And while the Romans eventually did come out on top, I say it's a pointless war because within a couple of years, all the Italians were granted citizenship. Whether or not they had fought in the war against Rome, everyone was granted citizenship. So, whole bunch of bloodshed for nothing.
So it was just kind of about pride in the end.
yes. But this is really when citizenship began being opened up. And you see people who aren't Roman becoming Roman.
Right.
You know?
So the previous model had kind of been like the Greek city-state kind of definition of citizen, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And now it's opening up into these much broader categories.
Precisely. I mean, a few of them, or a decent number of them really, they'd been Roman because their parents had been Roman, and then they'd moved away from Rome, or they'd married someone in another city-state, the whole 9 yards. And there were a good number of Romans outside of Rome. They're just, not all of them were citizens.
Right.
And since there was, 30, 40% of them were all Romans anyway, they all wanted to be Romans because they basically were. They were just treated like second-class citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a reason for that rebellion. It was just Rome was being stupidly prideful for no reason whatsoever, which is pretty standard for Rome.
It's a common tale.
Yeah, extremely. So you see these armies, and these are the armies of the late Republic that we see were honestly really incredible under the hands of a skilled general. And most of the wars that we really study at this time are the wars between these armies, when we see Romans fighting Romans. And, I mean, first of all, we see this with the Marians fighting off the Sullans. Sulla was one of Marius' generals who rebelled against him. That's a terrible explanation. Long story short, there were civil wars. Where first Sulla took over Rome with his army and used his army to basically bully all the Marians out. And he headed back off to Greece to fight another war. Marius came back with his own army, took over Rome, started killing a whole bunch of people. And then Sulla decided to come back. Marius dropped dead, probably of a stroke. And there was another civil war where Romans fought Romans. And this one extended farther than just the Italian peninsula. One of the more famous Romans that no one's ever heard about is a guy named Sartorius, who was in Spain. He was a Marian in Spain, and he was fighting against the Sullan armies over there. And he was a really, really brilliant general. He used essentially guerrilla tactics because he was outgunned, outmanned, and had absolutely no hope of reinforcement. And the guy fighting against him was a famous young general who had been noted for being really, really, really skilled under Sulla. And his name was Gaius Pompeius. You might know of him as Pompey the Great. This is in his relative youth, and it's sort of telling that Sartorius kicks Pompey's ass up and down the Spanish peninsula for years.
So even with these guerrilla tactics, or being forced to resort to these, he's incredibly successful.
Oh yes, and Pompey has a really terrible time of it until he just gets enough men and enough reinforcement to completely put down Sartorius. Sartorius actually committed suicide before he was completely defeated. I believe he was still undefeated, but he lost so many men, lost basically everything, had no supply lines left. He figured, I'm done.
So this is going on in Spain, but so obviously this Marian versus Sulla conflict is going on throughout the reaches of kind of Roman influence. I mean, so do we see these kind of conflicts between generals loyal to either side in any other places besides like Spain or the Italian peninsula? Or
those were the most remarkable ones. I'm honestly not 100% sure if there was something going on again in Greece, but there were other kings, other regions that tried to take advantage of this internal Roman disorder, and they were punished pretty harshly when Rome was less distracted. The most famous one was Mithridates of Pontus. He was a king. He was known as the Poison King, and he started about 5 or 6 different wars against Rome because he just really, really, really wanted to take over Greece, among other things, and he really hated Romans. So he started multiple wars against them, and every time Rome had to go over there, they kicked his tail, but had to return to Rome because of internal conflict, until Pompey eventually defeated him later on.
Okay, so how does this Marian versus Sulla conflict kind of play out?
It plays out really, really, really poorly for Rome as a whole. Sulla does eventually crush the entire Marian insurrection, but he goes into Rome and tries to turn it back to what it used to be, while changing the laws to try to fix things sort of half-assed. He executed basically everyone who he didn't like, and then a whole bunch more people who had money, which he needed to pay his soldiers, who were in the forum, harassing and intimidating senators.
So it's a nice standard regime change, in other words.
Yeah, basically it is a standard regime change. And the soldiers, they weren't just soldiers anymore. They were the basis of his power. However much he denied it, he said Rome is free again. Rome is back under the control of the Romans. He gave up his dictatorship after only, a little while, despite the fact that he'd been granted a dictatorship for perpetuity, or until the problem has finished. Mm-hmm. He declared the problem to be finished, and therefore clearly it was finished.
So he steps down, but obviously he's not powerless. He still has this army that's loyal to him and standing by.
Not only that, he's already killed all the people who might have offended him anyway, so he's got no problems with it. He only lived a couple of years after he stepped down. He headed down to basically his pleasure villa and died from a really nasty disease. That essentially happened with Sulla, but the problem is these years of civil war, starting from the Social War straight on through the Marius-Sulla Wars, they sort of sparked an entire new mindset in Rome, where if you had an army, you were able to get political power. If you were able to get political power, you were able to get more armies and more money to support more armies. It slowly became a spiral. There were 2 pretty big individuals. Pompey, as I mentioned earlier, kept becoming more and more famous, kept gathering more and more power, and there came a point after he got back from the Sartorian War over in Spain. Sulla was dead for quite some time. He came back at the behest of a gentleman who he really despised. These guys just hated each other. A gentleman named Crassus. And Crassus was having some trouble on the Italian peninsula because he was trying to chase out this escaped gladiator named Spartacus, who had been stomping over these Roman levies. Because what had happened was Spartacus rebelled, so the Senate basically told a lower down magistrate to, get 1,000 men, equip them, and go kill the slave, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. They weren't expecting Spartacus to win. And then he kept winning over army after army after army after army. And they started getting a bit worried because, I mean, this is a slave. He's not supposed to be winning battles. He's not supposed to be killing Romans and stealing all their armor. And I mean, this started getting embarrassing and expensive.
Right.
And Crassus, the one thing that he never really had was military glory. He had money. He had power. He had basically half of Rome in his debt. And, you know, he could pull strings wherever he wanted them. But he never really had that military glory that was just so huge to the Roman psyche. And without that glory, he was sort of not seen as great as Pompey, for example. Pompey gets back. Crassus has just defeated Spartacus's army, and Pompey kills a couple thousand of the stragglers, declares that he just achieved victory over this massive slave rebellion all by himself, and then heads to Rome to get a triumph, because he triumphed over Sartorius. Crassus, needless to say, is not too happy about this, so he follows Pompey up, and both of them have their armies right there, outside of Rome, and they both are refusing to disband them, because they're basically playing a game of chicken, saying, you disband your army first.
Right.
Then I'll disband my army.
And as I understand it at this time, especially with these client armies, the idea was kind of you don't keep them around like the capital. You keep them out in the kind of far flung places. You don't want to bring them into the actual city, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was expected that you would keep your army in its province, basically. If you were assigned a provincial control, you were expected to keep your army in that province. Skipping forward a little bit, that was the issue with Julius Caesar. Everyone knows, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The Rubicon was that one place he wasn't supposed to cross, but no one really knows why.
Right,
well, it's because it was the border to Gaul, between Gaul and Italy. And when he crossed that border, he was outside of his own province. And since he was outside of his own province, that was something extremely illegal, because he was actually invading another province, which just happened to be Italy. So that was the issue behind Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. You were basically expected to keep your army where you had imperium over the army, or imperium over the people. The imperium, the best way to describe it, I guess, would be to say it's the power of life and death. It's often described as an individual being the governor of a region, but that doesn't quite do justice, because you weren't just a governor, you were the supreme commander of that region. You had absolute authority. The Senate, you supposedly conferred with the Senate to make sure, that they agreed with what you did, but you didn't have to confer with the Senate. Most people didn't. You had
quite a deal of autonomy then.
Yeah, you had basically absolute autonomy over whatever you wanted to do. And people took advantage of this for obvious reasons. I mean, hey, you know what you're going to do with a nice little region that's totally under your control? Well, how about you just pay off all the political debts that got you that region in the first place? And then how about you make yourself a little bit of money, and a lot more money, and some more money. And
right. Rome can have a little bit of the taxes, but really, I need this. I need this larger share.
I need, a golden-plated swimming pool for science.
Right.
For reasons. But yeah, that's essentially what having one of these provinces meant. And as I was saying before, when Crassus and Pompey both camped outside Rome with their armies, everyone expected another war, straight up, until, one of these guys in the Senate had the brilliant idea that he totally came up with all by himself of both of them just disband their legions at the same time, and then they can both be consul. Yay! That'll work out great! Yeah, they both really hated each other, and absolutely nothing got done during their consulship, because they just kept vetoing each other. Needless to say, it didn't go over too well. And with these guys just having their little hate orgy over here, it sort of kept Rome balanced for a little while, because they hated each other so much, and they both had very extensive networks of clients who sort of were under them. Rome sort of basically functioned normally. there was a whole ton of politics that was going outside of just Pompey and Crassus. The standard people trying to ascend up the political ladder, people having their own little armies, stuff going on in Greece, stuff going on in Egypt, Africa, Spain, Gaul, the whole 9 yards. You don't generally hear too much about that. You hear about Rome at this point, especially because Julius Caesar was the up-and-comer. Well, not the up-and-comer. He was just one of many up-and-comers. He was just a little bit more flamboyant about it than anyone else. He was well known for being out there. He was as extravagant as he could possibly make himself. And which, it's a decent strategy for a politician. I mean, catch everyone by surprise, and hey, people will know your name.
Right. So one of the things that when I was doing some reading, when we're talking about these client armies and we're talking about Caesar, all the troops that had been in these client armies or the standard are these Roman soldiers or Italian soldiers, right? And then Caesar apparently starts doing some like local recruitment then in his provinces.
Yeah, Caesar decided the rules didn't quite apply to him because he was Caesar and he didn't feel like having to deal with rules because rules are silly little things that he didn't have to deal with apparently. So he sort of pulled Caesar's, like when he was kidnapped by pirates. He, promised them the whole time, I'm going to crucify you guys. I'm going to crucify you guys. And they laughed at him because, this little kid. He's like maybe 20 at the outside off the top of my head. What's he going to do? I mean, he doesn't have any authority whatsoever. And honestly, Caesar did not have any legal authority. But as soon as they returned him to land, he recruited an army from these non-Roman citizens, took it straight over to the pirates, and crucified them. He paid them, disbanded them after that. But
they really had no one to blame but themselves. I mean,
exactly. They didn't believe it. He's Caesar. You always believe Caesar, no matter how crazy it is. But that was Caesar's problem. He decided, rules don't apply to him. So when he would recruit his armies, he recruited a few Spanish legions. They were Spanish legions. Spain had been under the control of Rome for, a couple centuries at this point. It was basically Roman, but they weren't necessarily all Romans who were recruited.
Right.
Caesar he liked bending rules a little bit whenever he felt like it. Sometimes it wasn't just a little bit, but it was sort of a marked difference between the earlier Republic, where they placed such a heavy emphasis on citizenship, owning land, being such huge components of being able to do one of the most Roman things in the world is join the army. And Caesar basically did away with the citizenship. The land was already gone, but citizenship didn't matter so much to Caesar. If you could fight, and if you were willing to fight, he would take you and say, yeah, he's totally a Roman citizen. Sure.
So with the client armies, with the Roman citizens that were recruited, obviously they're getting, like we've said a couple times, they're getting their gear supplied and they're getting this kind of standard. Is that also extended to these non-Roman citizens that are getting folded in? These aren't Absolutely. Like bring your own gear. These are in the standard form and they're getting paid for.
Yep, Caesar paid for everything. He equipped his armies with other people's money. He paid them with other people's money. And he gave them bonuses from other people's money. Caesar took out a lot of loans, and that was another big hallmark of this period in Roman history is you have loans. Basically, the super wealthy are paying for everything, and everyone else is borrowing a lot from them. And borrowing took the form of favors, like, I'll do you a favor in the future if you give me enough money to run for this political campaign. And I'll pay you back. Just don't give me any interest on this loan. Mm-hmm. And that was basically how things worked. Armies, people weren't necessarily wealthy enough to always afford their own armies, but they could usually borrow enough for it if they, were in that position.
So Caesar's got these armies and he's, breaking the rules with them and whatever, and he's borrowing money to finance them and then borrowing money for political power and whatnot. And what is he doing actually with these armies to kind of bolster his political power?
Well, he after he was consul, he had this alliance that we know now as the First Triumvirate, even though it was basically a semi-formal, hey, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine kind of thing, with both Crassus and Pompey, who were pissed off at the Senate more than each other for once, and they needed sort of a third person to keep them from killing each other. That was Caesar. He was relatively unimportant at the time, and he decided that he wanted to have proconsular control over Gaul. And Gaul was, at this point, it was, a tiny strip of the bottom of France that connected Italy to Spain, and it was Cisalpine Gaul, which is the near Gaul, the near side of the Alps. And there was also Gaul, which we know as France, but that was sort of technically not his province, but his province technically said he had control over Gaul, so technically all of that was his province, kind of thing. Does that make sense?
All Gaul is divided into three, something along those lines.
Yeah. He essentially lawyered it so that it would be, understood that, oh yeah, I'm legally in control of Gaul. I'm not lying about this at all, and I can make as much money off these guys as I want to. So he spent, the next 10 years in Gaul fighting his war against the Gauls, the Britons, the Germans, basically everything up there. He published these fabulous series of letters that we now know as the Gallic Wars.
Right.
He sent to Rome and had read to the people. Fantastic. But during that time, clearly his armies were honestly the best in the Roman world at this point. Honestly, over the course of 10 years of war, these veterans know their stuff. They were really, really good, even though his legions were worn down by the end of it because, casualties happen. They were still above and beyond anything else in the Roman world. And there were a lot of legions. At one point, these armies are, when Caesar and Pompey eventually go to war, the armies are, in the range of 100,000 men on a battlefield. It's large-scale warfare on something we can't really comprehend nowadays is what this might have looked like. Either way, Caesar's men were disciplined to a fault and incredibly loyal to their commander. Even when, times were tough, they were starving, they were besieged, the whole 9 yards, it looked like they could never make it out alive. They trusted in their commander because he had never let them down before. So
when he's in Gaul, kind of doing his thing in Gaul, as Caesar is famous for doing, I'm assuming there was some kind of recruitment and kind of replenishment of forces, even though he is getting worn down, as you say. So what is this? What mainly does this take the form in? Is he getting more troops from like the Roman side of things than local, or what are we seeing with this? Because we were talking about his penchant for breaking the rules and doing all this local recruitment, but
actually with his Gallic Wars, he didn't recruit locally. He actually didn't replenish his armies.
So these are all just what he had in the beginning.
Yep, they're what he had in the beginning, and while they got worn down, those low armies were still stronger than anything else in the Roman world. Even though they were outnumbered heavily, they could still kick the tail of anything 3-1.
So he does eventually end up going to war against Pompey. The triumvirate does not last as indefinite.
No, it doesn't. And the story of that is sort of another mark on how the power of the Roman legion was almost entirely dependent on the commander of that legion. Because you have Caesar, and I've told you these guys are the best Rome has to offer. But then if you take a step back and you look at one of his colleagues, if you look at Crassus, that guy who's never had any military reputation, even though he really desperately wanted it, that was the one thing he wanted to do, was to be good at the military, and he just sucked at it. To be fair, he sucked at it. He didn't know what he was doing. So he decided, he was assigned the proconsular, the governorship of the East, and all that entailed. And, well, Caesar was invading Gaul and getting rich and getting famous. And, well, that's technically only a part of this province. So technically, Parthia is part of the East, right? Quote unquote. That's essentially what you have Crassus doing. It didn't work out too well for him. His army was absolutely crushed by a scouting force of the Parthians. It wasn't even the Parthian army, which was in a completely different place. It was just a small scouting force of cavalry that the Parthian general just was hoping would delay the Romans a little bit.
So, obviously, does Crassus survive this encounter? And
No.
No.
He goes out to try to parley with the Parthians, and they cut his head off. Yeah, he didn't actually have gold poured down his throat to kill him. He may have had his head dipped in gold, we don't know, but he had his head chopped off.
So then after Crassus and his army are defeated, the two kind of major powers in the Roman political and military landscape are then Caesar doing his thing in Gaul, and what is Pompey doing at this time?
He's pretending that he's ruling over, his proconsular areas, which are, pretty rich, and he's not. He basically, he's sitting outside Rome with his army in his villa. He doesn't have much of an army that he's sitting outside Rome with. It's only, one or two legions, and eventually he demands Caesar give back a couple of the legions that Caesar borrowed from him, which Caesar does, and then Pompey decides he can't actually trust them because they've been with Caesar for like 8 years. So that's one of the reasons he actually fled to Greece immediately when Caesar invaded Italy. It's because he couldn't even trust the men he had to stay with him, and lo and behold, they went right back to Caesar.
So there was kind of this big. It was not just you were loyal to whatever general you were under. It was you were loyal to kind of your training general or whoever recruited you or whoever you were under the longest.
Yeah, well, I mean, you got to think of the men's mindset. They were under Caesar for a while. Caesar was one of the most incredibly charismatic leaders of his time. Honestly, there was a reason all of his troops loved him as much as they did. So it was quite possible he just worked his charm on these guys too.
Okay, so are there any challengers to, now that Pompey's kind of fled and Caesar is the main power, are there any challengers to that? Are there any armies that are kind of taken up in a way where, I have money and I want fame, like Crassus wanted to try?
Well, Pompey actually did, because he ran over to Greece and he started raising his armies, which, because he had control over the East at this point, since Crassus was dead, Pompey had control over all his stuff. He started raising up armies from all of them. Started saying, okay, all you guys, ship me men. I need men. I need lots of men. And that was the army he used against Caesar. Was an army that was... There were a good number of Romans in it, but it wasn't a Roman... I mean, it wasn't, a hardcore Roman army kind of thing. Again, it's an example of rules can be bent.
And then you obviously have this big full-on conflict between Caesar and Pompey, and then Caesar is the one who emerges victorious. What kind of reforms, if any, does Caesar put on this client's or this client army system? Because obviously this is what brought him to power, but this is also something that he is well aware could bring other people to power. Is there anything that he does in that?
Well, Caesar himself doesn't actually do anything about it because he declares, or he has himself declared, I should say, dictator for life, in perpetuum. And he has this done, and he spends about 6 months in Rome. I say in Rome sort of with air quotes because Caesar was a man of almost boundless energy. That's one of the things that all our sources absolutely agree on when it comes to the man, is he had energy that was beyond anything anyone else could imagine. He was everywhere at once, and he did 4 or 5 things all at the same time, just because his mind was just that active. He almost couldn't help but to do as many things as he possibly could, which was really bad for his politics because it looked like he was ignoring people when he would be dictating 2 letters at the same time while talking to them. But he was only in Rome for about 6 months. During those 6 months, he had a whole boatload of civil reform but he was also mustering legions to head to Parthia because he felt like avenging Crassus and basically showing the Parthians how it was done. Then in March, 6 days before he would head out to Parthia, he was murdered at the foot of a statue of Pompey.
Right, he obviously didn't get to retire upon his little villa and whatnot, but...
Yeah, unfortunately for Caesar. I don't think retirement would have suited Caesar, to be quite honest. He was too vivacious.
He doesn't seem like the guy who would go out and shoot a couple of holes on the green and sip his wine content.
No.
So
no.
So he doesn't pass any kind of military reforms or do anything with there, and he obviously doesn't have a huge long reign as this dictator for life. It is for his life, but it's not quite as long as he probably planned. So how about post his death? I mean, is the scene, do people kind of see, oh, this system that we had of the client armies, this could turn bad again, or is it kind of kept?
Unfortunately, by that time, it was 44 BCE, which is give or take 63 years-ish after Marius reformed it. And the Romans, they were, sadly, as sad as this might sound, they were almost universally power-hungry. Everything they did was for personal gain, personal power, and family glory. And these client armies, well, they were really good at achieving that for everyone involved. The armies were not reformed after Caesar's death. They, interestingly enough, reverted to almost a warlord status, where there were warlords who would take over these armies. And we know those warlords by their names. We know them as a gentleman named Lepidus and a gentleman named, well, according to Cicero, who refused to call him by his adopted name, Octavianus, who called himself Gaius Julius Caesar. And then we have Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, who was another one of these men who controlled armies. One really interesting fact is, they eventually all came together with armies in only a couple years after Caesar had died, maybe 42. And they formed the Second Triumvirate. And one interesting theory that I've been reading a little bit into is that it wasn't necessarily the men themselves who were too keen on this, because Octavian was just a kid, 20 years old. I'm sure many of our listeners out there are 20 years old, or maybe a little bit older. A 20-year-old commanding thousands and thousands of men with a huge amount of money and power at his back. It sounds ridiculous. The Romans thought so too. They basically called him a kid all the time because, well, he was a kid. They basically said he doesn't know what he's doing. Just pet him on the head, exalt him, and ignore him. Were Cicero's words, actually. Well, they met in the north to probably with ideas about fighting each other. But the Romans with them weren't too keen on this. They didn't want to fight each other. All these men in the legions, they were all veterans of Caesar's. They knew each other intimately. They were very, very close, as only, men in an army can be. They didn't want to fight each other. And that reluctance to fight was probably one of the things that convinced the three to make an alliance in that Second Triumvirate. And this Second Triumvirate essentially held strong for 10 years, which, you hear oftentimes the Second Triumvirate happened, and then Mark Antony and Octavian went to war and killed blah, 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 Actium, and then Augustus came out on top. But they forget that there are 10 years in there where Rome is ruled pretty decently. Rome is ruled by Augustus. Mark Antony takes the east, the wealthy side, and Lepidus gets Spain and Africa, basically. And eventually that's called down because he's being a nuisance to the other two. They don't like him, and they decide to basically just exile him to ignore him. But the army itself doesn't change in this period of time. And it's not until after Actium, after 32 BC, when Augustus is left alone in charge. He sees he has 60 legions. 60 legions. If you average them to maybe 5,000 men a legion. That's 300,000 men. It's a huge, huge number. And Augustus knew he didn't have any need for this, and he wanted to show people that he just wasn't another military tyrant. He was trying to, in his own way, preserve the illusion of the Republic. With him, he could be in charge, sort of in the background, pulling strings. He'd be the most prominent man, but he didn't want to look like a military king that Caesar was sort of seen as. So he established his own reforms, and while those did take time, they included stuff like reducing the number of legions by essentially half, and most of those were basically just garrisons. Mm-hmm. He set up garrisons across the empire to ensure stability, and there really aren't a lot of those garrisons. If you look at a map, they're around the borders, sure, but the center of the empire, nothing, no men. Augustus clearly had the army behind him, but he didn't have to flaunt it. It was known. The military was professionalized. Training was professionalized. This the idea of officers and maybe ranking up with them as a career, that became a thing. The idea of client armies was sort of phased out by Augustus in a way, because the way he worked it was that the princeps, the first citizen, later known as the emperor, would be the one patron for all the armies. Everyone under that reported straight to him. So armies reported to the princeps. They didn't report to their general. They reported to the guy above the general, kind of thing. So their loyalty was secured by the princeps and not by the legate, who was in charge of them directly.
Well, so that's obviously quite the trip from the farmer seasonal armies that we start out with into this kind of commander-in-chief, organized, professional, veteran armies.
Yeah. Wow. And that sort of, I guess, cuts it at the end, because that's the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire.
Right. Well, is there anything you feel like you didn't get to talk about that you'd like to add on, or anything you'd just like to add in general?
I think I basically covered the whole of it, but I will hang around the thread. If anybody has any questions, I will be more than happy to answer them.
All right. Well, thank you, Celebreth, for giving this seemingly long, but in truth, probably very, very brief and short history of the Roman army and reforms.
Yeah, I didn't even go into all the fun wars.
Well, thank you very much for coming around and recording this.
It's my pleasure.
And it is our pleasure as well to bring you another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Roman history told through more of a military lens, to kind of get an idea of how inextricably tied that history was to the developments and really sometimes even the machinations of just single men who were dominating both the political, the social, and the military field through their use of essentially their generalship as much as it was anything else. Coming up next fortnight, however, we're going to move away from military topics and talk to Commustar about African urbanism. In the meantime, please do rate and review us on or wherever else you're rating and reviewing podcasts. That helps bump our popularity and visibility and gives you more people to discuss this with when you want to discuss it. You can also go to our discussion posts that we put up every time we publish an episode on our subreddit, Ask Historians, where you can ask Celebreth any questions about lingering follow-up questions that you had about the episode, or you can ask me or Jaffs about anything to do with the podcast. We're on basically every single streaming service known to humanity at this point. We also have a YouTube page that we're putting up past episodes on, and a SoundCloud page that we are putting up the last couple episodes, the most recent ones. Those are all linked in the discussion post, so please do come visit. Until then, have a good fortnight.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.